Came up with the 1.2 billion. That was a true and accurate number. But the media, particularly the Orlando Sentinel, really hounded me and said, first of all, she's not telling the truth. It's not 641, it's 432. That turned out to be wrong. Then they said, and the project is 615, but they were not adding the numbers together. When I came up with 1.2, then they were saying those numbers were wrong. My numbers were correct from the very beginning because I was using their documents. So this project was $1.2 billion. Come to find out that FDOT cut this deal with CSX and did not need any legislative approval whatsoever. There was absolutely nothing from a legislative standpoint that I could do to stop the money on this deal. And you know what's really interesting about this? I happened to be sitting on the Transportation Committee and never knew one iota about this deal. But CSX did need something. And because CSX needed something, FDOT needed something of the legislature. And that is CSX as part of this deal. You pay to make our freight improvements. You pay us for the track. But we want to continue to run freight on that track. So we'll no longer own it, but we want to use it. We no longer have to pay property taxes on it, but we want to use it. We no longer have to maintain it. Now the state has to pay to maintain it, but we want to use it. And by the way, we want you to double track it and improve it. So the state's going to pick up the cost of doing all that, and CSX is going to use it. But that wasn't enough. Then they wanted indemnification on that track. And this is what that FDOT needed from the legislature. CSX said, if it were not for commuter rail, if there was an accident on the track, that would involve passengers or commuters on the train, then we should be held responsible for anything that happens, and the taxpayers ought to be on the hook for paying for that. Okay, first of all, if you buy into that argument, then the deal would have been structured a little differently, because it would have been a fault system, or it would have been only if it pertained to those individuals on the train. The way this language was written is any accident, whether it involves a commuter train or not, whether it involves a passenger or not, any accident, even if it was only a freight train, even if it was the freight train's sole responsibility, all the damage would be borne by the taxpayers of the state of Florida, except for damage to the freight train itself or any employees on the freight train. And I've been told that at most you have maybe 3 employees on a freight train. So if a freight train goes through a crossing, if there was a malfunction of the crossing arm, if a busload of school children were killed on that crossing, that would be on the state of Florida, the taxpayers, you, even though it has nothing to do with commuter rail. And that's the bill that was before us. The bill before us had nothing to do with the money. It had nothing to do with the commuter rail system itself. It had to do with transferring the liability. And that's what I went after. And so that's a pretty long explanation, but kind of the history of my involvement. Now let me tell you this. When I first found out that this was a bad deal for my constituents in Lakeland, Congressman Micah sought me out. He called me from Washington and demanded a meeting in Lakeland on a Saturday. I agreed to meet with him because I thought, before I knew how much the deal cost and before I got involved in the commuter rail portion of it, I really thought there might be a win-win situation where Central Florida could get their commuter rail. And keep in mind, at that point, I thought the price of commuter rail was $400 million. I didn't have any idea it would eventually get up to $2.6 billion. So I agreed to meet with him. He showed up with 5 CSX people and 5 FDOT people. And it became apparent immediately that this was not a meeting to try and hammer out a negotiated change in the plan. He took control of the meeting very quickly and pretty much said, this is a done deal. There is absolutely nothing you can do to stop it. Lakeland's just going to have to accept its fate. It's not going to be 54 trains. And if you end up with 5 or 6 or 8 more trains, that's just tough for Lakeland. Orlando's much more important than you. And pretty much, shut up and go away, little girl. That made me really mad. And, you know, I've had my motives questioned as to why I got involved in this and her husband this and high-speed rail this. If you want to know my motivation to get involved in the issue in the first place was to answer my constituents' requests. But my motivation to stick to this, like a dog on a bone, was that meeting with Congressman Micah when he basically said, we cut a deal behind closed doors. It's been in the works for 4 years, and I'll be damned if you are going to break up a deal that I had, this sweetheart deal that I had. And what bothered me the most is when I learned more about this deal, this was never about commuter rail. The commuter rail portion of it is very small. This was all about a freight subsidy, and then it became a development tool for several people in the Orlando area who were going to make money off the development of a commuter rail. Why do I think it wasn't about commuter rail? By their own projections, the ridership on this is 3,500 people. How can you justify $2.6 billion for 3,500 riders? And you don't even know if that means 3,500 cars coming off I-4. That could be people who would have taken the bus. That could have been people who, 2 or 3 of them ride in one car. I don't think it solved a congestion problem. I don't think it was about moving people. I think it was about a subsidy for a very profitable freight company. I think it was a very bad deal, and I am ashamed, embarrassed, and angry at the Florida Department of Transportation for cutting these kind of deals behind closed doors. Do you know who worked the hardest against me the last 2 years that I've been fighting this? It wasn't CSX lobbyists. It was the Florida Department of Transportation. They were visiting with members and they were lobbying for this deal. I thought they worked for us. Apparently they worked for CSX. Apparently they worked for vendors. And that's really, in my mind, the underlying story that kept me going here. If I ever did run for governor, and that's a very big if, one of the first things I want to do is revamp the Florida Department of Transportation. Our Florida budget, when I started in the legislature in 1996, was $43 or $46 billion. It grew to well over $70 billion, and now through several years of cutting back, we're at $62 billion. The Florida Department of Transportation's portion of that budget, and that budget is a big document, the Florida Department of Transportation's portion until recently was $8 billion. They spent $8 billion in 12 pages because they have no line items. They don't show you where they're spending the money. They'll have a line item that says paving, and then, and I'm making up a number here, it may say $900 million. We have no idea what they're spending it on. It may say bridges, and then it'll have a large number. We don't know what it is. It says rail grants, and that's a pretty large number. We have no idea what's in there. When we ask questions, they say they'll get back to us with that information. Or they say, we'll give you another document, and then they bring you a document this thick that you have no idea what you're looking at. There needs to be transparency in the transportation budget. This never would have slid under the radar screen. This would have been properly vetted. And if it was a good project, it would have made it through. But it's not a good project. It was never done in the open. It never had input from the people who were negatively affected. And from what I understand from the people who live in the Orlando area, that public referendums had been voted down time after time. So it wasn't the people asking for the project. It was CSX, the Florida Department of Transportation, and maybe some developers. I am not against rail. I love rail. I love mass transit. I would love to see Floridians get out of their cars and get on foot, get on bikes, get on buses, get on trains, but the deal has to make sense. And we know that mass transit doesn't pay for itself. But let's take an example from South Florida. Tri-Rail, our only commuter rail system in the entire state of Florida, has been in existence for 20 years. And it went through the same grant process that this project was trying to go through the federal government for a New Starts grant. They have much denser population in the Miami, Broward, and Palm Beach counties. It took Tri-Rail 20 years to build up ridership to 15,000 people. 15,000 people is not great ridership, but it's pretty good ridership. Last year, Tri-Rail had an operating loss of $80 million. Tri-Rail, in existence for 20 years, still doesn't have a dedicated funding source. But FDOT isn't trying to keep Tri-Rail operating. The people in Orlando that were pushing this deal were not trying to keep Tri-Rail operating. If this was really about commuter rail, wouldn't you preserve the system you already have, that you've already invested hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars in, that now has a ridership of 15,000 per day? They're not trying to do that. This isn't about commuter rail. And have we learned no lessons?